The book today is Second Language Acquisition by Rod Ellis. This is another book. This is not pleasure reading. This is something I read for professional development. Also, I've got this book club going at work now where we read books for professional development. This is something I did in conjunction with that. What we've been trying to do with this book club is read stuff for professional development because it helps you professionally develop. And we've been trying to limit ourselves to books off of the recommended Delta reading list, as defined by the Distance Delta folks. They've got a list of texts. And this was one of the books on the texts. On their list. So I think what we've our rough arrangement is we thought we'd do kind of one book on theory, one practical book, one book on theory, one practical book. I don't know how long we're going to be able to keep that going because there's a limited amount of books on theory, but so far we were due for another book on theory. We had read How Languages Are Learned, which is a theory book. Then we were doing Beyond the Sentence, which was a practical book. Now we're doing, we were back to a theory book, Second Language Acquisition by Rod Ellis. I had read a Rod Ellis book a few years back, which I think, I'm going to blank on the title now. It was something like Understanding SLA Research. SLA, of course, meaning Second Language Acquisition. This had been at the library of my old school. I just kind of picked it up when I was kind of thumbing through their titles and read through it. I found it a little bit of a hard go. Not impossible. It wasn't the worst thing I've ever read. I got through it, but I just had to kind of, pin my ears back and concentrate on it. The text did not yield its meaning easily, but if you focused on it, it was no problem. And I'm not the smartest guy in the room, so if I can get through it, I think most people can get through it. But I did have to work at it a bit. But Rod Ellis really knows his stuff, so I thought, okay. This should be a book where we really get into it. To be honest, I thought this book would be longer than it was because I knew somehow I picked up. I don't remember where I picked this up, but there's some very kind of big books by Rod Ellis which act as an introduction to the theory of second language acquisition, and I thought maybe this was that book. But no, I think the book, he lists this in his references. The 800-page book that he had written on the subject is called The Study of Second Language Acquisition, published in 1994. This is not that book. This book is 147 pages, but actually the main text of this book is only 90 pages. So that this is a kind of a very brief overview, but that has its place. Also, this is part of the Oxford Introductions to Language Study. So it's part of a series, and the series I think is designed for the novice. And so this is not Rod Ellis at his most technical. It's for the most part fairly readable. I personally found the beginning chapters quite readable. Around chapter 7, which is the linguistic aspects of interlanguage, I thought, okay, at this point I thought, he's not explaining this well. But actually, the other person in my book club talked about this and he didn't have any problem with it. So maybe it's just me. And even me, I got through it. I just thought he was getting a little technical here and not kind of explaining stuff as well as he could have. Book was published in 1997, so it's not up to date, presumably. although I regret to say I don't have enough knowledge to critique it. Like, I'm not sure where it would be out of date, but I guess presumably a book that's 20 years old now is going to be out of date in some facets. The setup of this series, apparently each book in this series, which was published in 1997, follows the same format. There's a survey of kind of the topic, and then there's readings. So from page 91 to page 120, it's a selection of readings. Each of it is like a brief excerpt from the literature with a brief introduction and kind of discussion questions at the end. It's an interesting idea. Couple problems with it. These excerpts seem, first of all of the readings kind of relate back to a chapter. So, chapter 1, the introduction, describing, explaining L2 acquisition. You've got a couple readings on that. Now, if I had to do this all over again, if I read this book a second time, what I would do is I'd read chapter 1, and then I'd go back and I'd do the readings related to chapter 1. And then I'd read chapter 2, and then I'd go and do the readings related to chapter 2. What I did, and what the other people in the book club did as well, because we didn't know any better, is we just read the book cover to cover, page 1 through to page 146. And then by the time you get to the readings, you're like, oh right, what was the context for that again? How did that relate? So it's a little bit confusing having these readings at the end, but if I had been a smarter reader, I could have worked around that easily enough by just jumping back to the readings after each chapter. So, if I ever do any other books in this series, I'll know to do that for next time. The second thing is, as interesting as these excerpts are, they're kind of so short that, short is good in one sense, but when something gets too short, you kind of lose the context. And it's difficult to understand what he's talking about because the excerpt is so short. A few of these excerpts are in danger of doing that. And then, unless I missed something, which I might have missed something, but some of these questions here, each of the excerpt has kind of discussion questions at the end of the excerpt. And some of the discussion questions relate back to things that aren't in the excerpt. For example, this is something that struck me, page 96, there's an excerpt here, and the discussion question is, the authors offer 2 possible reasons for why learners begin with no plus verb constructions. What are they? How can you decide which explanation is correct? In this excerpt, and it's a very short excerpt, so I don't think I missed anything because it's just like a paragraph long, and I reread it a few times just to make sure I didn't miss it. There were no explanations given. I think this didn't get proofread well enough in the process of taking all these excerpts. Sometimes they didn't actually get the right passage that related to the discussion questions. I think some of this, the key part of the passage that related to that discussion question got left on the cutting room floor. So that's another issue with it. Admittedly, those are all nitpicks. On the whole, that reading section at the end was nice, and the discussion questions at the end were quite good for book club because you've got the discussion questions kind of already laid out for you. And some of these discussion questions were actually kind of pretty thought-provoking. And then the third section is the references. Again, I don't know. Arguably, maybe the references should have been integrated into the text instead of having a section at the end with the references, but I don't know. Section on further reading at the end, I guess. So, the survey here. I'm getting to the point now where I've been reading. I have read a number of general introductions to second language acquisition. That I guess that's my own fault. I probably should be reading. I'm probably stuck in this rut where I keep reading general introductions, and what I should be doing by this stage is getting kind of deeper into it instead of keep coming back to the general introductions. On the other hand, it's good to review, as a consequence of that, little in this book was like brand new information to me. It was theories I was already familiar with, kind of coming at it from a slightly different angle because this was a different author, but there weren't any of these, oh wow, that is so interesting moments. It's just like, oh yeah, okay, that and that, heard this before. So as a consequence, I am going to be a bit of a boring reviewer on this because there's very little that kind of struck me, whereas I think the first few books I read on second language acquisition, I was able to give much longer reviews, and I was like, oh wow, this was interesting, and this was interesting, and I totally noticed this when I was learning Japanese, and I noticed this in my students. In this case, I'm getting a little bit numb to that. But just to kind of give a brief overview, he talks about second language acquisition, and he hits on a number of points in the field. So one of the issues that he brings up in the book is that there's no unifying theory of second language acquisition. There's a whole bunch of different theories that you can't take, that come at it from so many different perspectives that especially in an introduction book like this, you can't just talk about one theory. And he talks, this is actually a theme of the book. There's so many different theories. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? Interestingly enough, I kind of thought, well, yeah, it's a good thing. I mean, like, different theories, different perspectives. But he quotes from an author at the end in the reading who says, this is a mess. Like, we can't even write about, we can't even communicate with each other because everyone's using a different theory. And everyone's using different terminology, and people are just making up their own terminology. An example, this wasn't the example he used, but it strikes me as an obvious example. Krashen's distinction between learning and acquisition, which Krashenites will follow this terminology, and then other people will just use learning and acquisition interchangeably, and it creates some confusion, obviously. So whether this is a good thing or not is debated, but this is the way that the field is now. So he has a whole bunch of different chapters that just approach this from a different angle. The psycholinguistics aspects of it, the transfer from your L1, something which I thought was interesting. And again, none of this was new to me, but it comes at it at a different angle maybe. Something I thought was interesting was him talking about the social dynamics of language learning. Again, this has popped up in other books, but I don't know, Rod Ellis explained this particularly well, I thought. It appears to be the case that how much you want to be part of the target language community affects your ultimate fluency. So if you really want to integrate into the community, then you will be more likely to end up being fluent, whereas if you're like, well, I want to communicate with them, but I don't want to be one of them, then that means you'll develop communication strategies probably, but you won't ultimately get fluent. And I had always kind of thought like these sociological explanations for language learning were like a little bit soft and unscientific, and just kind of people who couldn't handle like the hard part of the psycholinguistics would kind of research this kind of stuff. But like this does appear to be the case, that one of the reasons people fossilize is because they're perfectly happy not being regarded as members of the target language. Whereas people who want to integrate into the target language, I mean, apparently what seems to be happening is the sociolinguistics and the psycholinguistics, there's an interplay there. A theory of accommodation, where if you want to be part of the community, you will start to, maybe even subconsciously, kind of alter your speech so that you become, your speech becomes like the part of the community that you're with. Now, I think we've all experienced this to some degree, even in our first language. Like, you start kind of talking like the people you hang out with. I've noticed this myself. I think I'm particularly prone to this. I'm very prone to picking up the speech patterns of whoever I'm hanging out with at the moment. Not even consciously. Not even largely consciously. So it's maybe a subconscious process. It's maybe like a subconscious process whereby learners who really want to integrate with the community this is causing their interlanguage to develop so that they reach kind of near native level proficiency, whereas people who don't want to integrate with them are kind of, they don't have the motivation maybe to integrate their language. It's the impression I got is that a lot of this could be largely subconscious. Again, just as a way we kind of subconsciously start talking about the people we hang out with. Although it wasn't exactly clear in the book whether this was conscious or subconscious processes. And in fact, elsewhere in the book, I think maybe this was maybe in the reading sections at the end, talks about maybe the distinction between consciousness and unconsciousness isn't quite as clear as we think it is. So maybe these are not useful distinctions. So that was something that popped up in a few chapters. And yeah, social aspects of interlanguage, which got me thinking about how the social aspects and the psycholinguistic aspects can kind of be, can kind of relate to each other. The linguistic aspects of interlanguage, chapter 7, really got into Chomsky's theories, which may or may not, I mean, I guess even within the field of linguistics, Chomsky's theories are always kind of falling in and out of favor, is my impression. I mean, I think it's a dominant theory in linguistics, but like every so often somebody will come up and challenge them, and so it, you know, it's even though it's a dominant theory in linguistics, it's up for debate possibly how true these are even with L1 acquisition, and then their approach to L2 acquisition is really up in the air. I suppose, no, I don't suppose, this is stated quite explicitly in the text. It relates to whether or not there's a critical period for universal grammar. So if there is a critical period for universal grammar, then it doesn't relate to L2 acquisition. But if there is not a critical period for universal grammar, then it could relate to L2 acquisition. So in this chapter, Rod Ellis goes through Chomsky's theories. And again, since I've read some of this before in other books, I knew what he was talking about, but I thought to myself, if I was brand new to the subject, I would have been completely lost. I mean, you know, just to read this here. He says, SLA also owes a considerable debt to another branch of linguistics, that associated closely with Noam Chomsky's theory of universal grammar. Chomsky argues that language is governed by a set of highly abstract principles that provide parameters which are given particular settings and different languages. Now that makes sense if you have a background in all this, but like if you were just completely new to this, like I think that would be a hard sentence to absorb. So like I wrote here in the margins, explain more, like he should have explained it more. To be fair, he does go on to give an example, but I don't think his example is particularly clear. On the other hand, everyone else in the book club got through it. So, like, yeah, people didn't have a problem with it. And then, yeah, individual differences, multiple perspectives in SLA. Yeah, on the whole, it's not a bad little book. I think there are some insightful. It's an introduction, and it's a short introduction at that. So you get what you pay for. If you want kind of an introduction to SLA theories, that's only 90 pages for the main text. You can expect a level of insight that corresponds to 90 pages. So, you know, like if you want to get deep into this stuff, this isn't the book for you. But I think, you know, the reason this was on the Delta reading list is because this is for people who need to get this under their belt as quickly as possible because they're taking the Delta and they don't have time to read the 800-page book. So that works out quite well for those people, and I felt like I got some useful review out of it, and it would be an exaggeration to say I learned nothing. I learned some few interesting things out of this, and it's well written, reasonably, mostly. So yeah, cautious recommendation if you're looking for professional development reading, and I'll finish here.
Mm-hmm.